The winter sky above the Solomon Islands held a secret in December 1942, one that would cost lives before its truth emerged. A teenage gunner named Eddie Kowalski gripped his Browning M2 machine gun inside a B-17 bomber, feeling the weapon vibrate violently in his hands, when a Japanese Zero appeared 300 yards away at 10 o'clock, slicing through the air like a thrown blade. Eddie followed every lesson drilled into him during training. He centered his crosshairs on the enemy fuselage and squeezed the trigger. 50 rounds erupted from the barrel, their tracer glow arcing through the thin atmosphere. Yet each bullet sailed harmlessly behind the Zero's tail. The Japanese pilot maintained his course, as though nothing had happened, while Eddie's ammunition counter continued its downward spiral. This scene repeated itself across every theater of war during those early years. Not as isolated failures, but as a systematic pattern. American gunners possessed rigorous training, fierce determination, and arguably the finest machine guns ever built, yet they consistently missed their targets. In early 1943, the Army Air Forces examined gun camera footage from bomber missions over Europe and the Pacific, uncovering a crisis of stunning proportions. Trained aerial gunners achieved hit rates below 4% against crossing targets. Of every 100 rounds fired at enemy aircraft moving perpendicular to the gunner, 96 found only empty air. The numbers painted a grim picture. Most engagements lasted 8 to 12 seconds before enemy fighters broke away or exceeded effective range. The Browning M2 fired roughly 800 rounds per minute, about 13 per second. In a 10-second window, a gunner might send 130 rounds skyward. At 4% accuracy, perhaps 5 bullets would connect. 5 hits could knock down a Zero, much less a rugged German Foch, Wolf Fu-190. Both German and Japanese fighters absorbed dozens of 50-caliber rounds and kept flying. The human toll defied comprehension. During 1943 alone, the 8th Air Force lost an average of 188 bombers monthly over Europe. With 10 men per B-17, that meant 1,880 aircrew killed, captured, or missing every 30 days. Many losses stemmed from bomber formations unable to generate effective defensive fire. The gunners executed their training flawlessly. They tracked targets, maintained proper sight pictures, and controlled their bursts with discipline. Courage and dedication were not the issue. Physics was the problem, and physics cared nothing for human bravery. Every gunner instinctively aimed at what his eyes showed him, perfectly aligned with every marksmanship principle ever taught. The logic worked perfectly against stationary targets on rifle ranges, or even deer moving at 20 miles per hour. But enemy fighters were not deer. They crossed the gunner's field of view at speeds exceeding 300 miles per hour. Late war designs, like the Messerschmitt Me 262 jet, reached 540 miles per hour. At such velocities, the time required for a bullet to travel from muzzle to target meant the target had already moved when the bullet arrived. Bullets moved fast, roughly 2,900 feet per second, leaving a Browning M2's barrel. Against slow targets at close range, this seemed instantaneous. But in aerial combat, close range meant 200 to 400 yards, and targets moved at speeds unimaginable 2 decades earlier. A Zero flying at 300 miles per hour covered 440 feet every second. The mathematics of a 300-yard shot were unforgiving. That distance equaled 900 feet. At 2,900 feet per second, the bullet needed roughly 0.31 seconds to cover the distance. During those 0.31 seconds, the Zero moved another 136 feet forward, 11 car lengths. The gunner aimed where the aircraft was, but the bullet arrived where the aircraft had been a third of a second earlier, passing through empty air while the enemy fighter continued untouched. Military scientists called this deflection error. They understood it theoretically long before World War II, but understanding something in a classroom and solving it amid combat were entirely different challenges. The required deflection was not a minor adjustment, but massive and profoundly counterintuitive. Against a target crossing at 90 degrees at 300 yards, A gunner needed to aim approximately 15 to 20 feet ahead of the aircraft's nose. This meant placing crosshairs on apparently empty sky, trusting the target would fly into the bullet stream. Every human instinct rebelled against this approach. Gunnery instructors attempted to teach deflection shooting during training, but results were dismal. The Army Air Force's Flexible Gunnery School at Laredo, Texas, implemented rigorous programs starting in 1942. Trainees spent hours in turret simulators, fired at towed targets from moving trucks, and studied diagrams illustrating proper lead angles. None of it translated effectively to actual combat. The problem was complexity. Deflection was not a single calculation, but changed constantly based on target speed, angle, range, altitude, whether the target was climbing or diving, and whether the bomber itself was turning. A B-17 ball turret gunner, engaging a Bf-109 during a frontal attack, needed different deflection than during a beam attack from the side. He had perhaps 4 seconds to process all these variables while being shot at, while his aircraft bucked through flak damage, while his oxygen mask fogged at 5,000 feet. The psychological barrier proved as deadly as the technical one. Gunners who survived initial missions and attempted deflection shooting often abandoned the technique after apparent failures. They would aim ahead of a target, fire a burst, watch their tracers arc through empty sky in front of the enemy plane, and conclude they had led too much. During the next engagement, they would reduce their lead, moving their aim point closer to the visible target. They were self-correcting in precisely the wrong direction, trusting their eyes over physics they could not see. Gun camera footage from 1943 missions revealed this pattern repeatedly. Initial bursts with some forward lead, followed by subsequent bursts walking backward until the gunner was shooting directly at or even slightly behind the target's current position. Casualties mounted relentlessly. 8th Air Force records from the October 1943 Schweinfurt missions showed 20% losses. 60 bombers failing to return from 290, one dispatched. Survivors landed with dead and wounded crewmen, shredded hydraulic lines, and engines trailing smoke. During debriefings, gunners reported identical frustration. They had been shooting, their guns had been functioning, but their bullets had not been connecting. Something fundamental had to change quickly, because at current loss rates, the Allied bombing campaign would collapse before ever reaching Berlin. The solution had been sitting in a filing cabinet since 1924, written by a man most combat aircrews had never heard of. Lieutenant Colonel James Puckle, an American artillery officer with exceptional talent for ballistics, had published a technical paper titled The Problem of Lead in Aerial Gunnery, while serving as an instructor at the Army's Field Artillery School. Puckle was not some disconnected academic. He had served in France during World War I, witnessed the first crude attempts at air-to-air combat, and recognized that aviation speeds were about to create a targeting crisis traditional marksmanship could not solve. His paper laid out the mathematics with brutal clarity. Puckle demonstrated that as aircraft speeds increased beyond 150 miles per hour, required deflection angles would exceed human intuitive capability. He calculated that against a target moving at 250 miles per hour at a perpendicular angle, a gunner would need to aim approximately 4 to 5 aircraft lengths ahead of the visible target. His paper included exhaustive tables and charts showing required lead for various combinations of target speed, range, and crossing angle. A 200-yard shot at a 90-degree crossing angle against a 300-mile-per-hour target required 47 feet of lead. The same target at 400 yards required 94 feet. The numbers were staggering, and Puckle's conclusion was even more disturbing. Without mechanical assistance, aerial gunners would become effectively useless within a decade. The Army filed his paper and forgot about it. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, military aviation advanced rapidly, but gunnery training remained rooted in World War I methodology. Instructors taught marksmanship fundamentals, sight picture, trigger control, breath control, as if students were preparing for rifle competitions rather than three-dimensional chases at 300 miles per hour. The few voices advocating for advanced deflection training were dismissed as alarmists. After all, Americans had always been excellent marksmen. Daniel Boone, Sergeant York, the frontier tradition of sharpshooting. Surely those skills would translate to aerial combat with proper practice. They did not. When the United States entered World War II in December 1941, Army Air Force's gunnery training was catastrophically unprepared for modern air combat reality. The standard training program lasted 4 weeks. Students fired roughly 1,000 rounds total during their entire qualification course. Most of that ammunition went towards stationary targets and slowly towed sleeves, moving at perhaps 150 miles per hour in predictable straight lines. Not a single training scenario replicated the chaos of an FW-190 diving through a bomber formation at 400 miles per hour while executing a barrel roll. Graduates received their wings, climbed into bombers, flew to England or the Pacific, and discovered their training was worthless the first time a zero flashed across their gun sight. By mid-1942, desperate commanders began searching through old technical libraries for anything that might help. A captain named Robert Williams, assigned to the 8th Air Force Gunnery Analysis Section, found Puckle's 1924 paper in the archives at Wright Field. Williams read it in one sitting, then immediately drafted a memo to his commanding officer with 2 words underlined 3 times. A new. Puckle had predicted this exact disaster 18 years before the first B-17 ever flew a combat mission over Europe. His calculations remained accurate, his warnings had been correct, and hundreds of American aircrewmen had died because nobody had listened. The question was not whether Puckle had been right. The mathematics were indisputable. The question was whether anything could actually be done about it. Training gunners to consciously calculate deflection angles while being shot at seemed impossible. The human brain could not process trigonometry at combat speed. But if conscious calculation would not work, perhaps something else would. The British had already begun finding answers, born from identical desperation during summer 1940. RAF Squadron 609, flying Spitfires from Middle Wallop, faced a gunnery crisis mirroring what American bombers would encounter 2 years later. Their pilots were brave, their aircraft magnificent, but they were missing. Flight Lieutenant John Dundas reviewed gun camera footage from July engagements and discovered his squadron's hit rate against crossing Messerschmitt Bf-109s hovered around 6%. The Spitfire carried enough ammunition for roughly 16 seconds of sustained fire. Pilots were exhausting their entire combat load watching German fighters fly home untouched. Squadron leader Horace Darley, commanding 609 Squadron, made a radical decision. He grounded his entire unit for 3 days in early August 1940, right in the middle of the Battle of Britain, when every fighter was desperately needed in the air, and conducted fire experiments that violated every standard in the RAF training manual. Darley had been a competitive clay pigeon shooter before the war, and he understood something about leading moving targets that military theorists had overlooked. The best shotgun shooters did not calculate lead. They felt it. Their brains processed target movement subconsciously. Their hands moved the barrel ahead of the clay disc without conscious mathematical thought. Darley wondered if fighter pilots could learn the same instinctive response. His experiment was brutally simple. He had a Hurricane fighter tow a target banner across the gunnery range while his Spitfire pilots made repeated firing passes. But instead of the standard approach, pilots aiming carefully, attempting to calculate precise lead angles, Darley instructed them to do something that sounded insane. Don't aim at all. Instead, watch the target's movement. Let your eyes track its path, and start firing while your aircraft is still turning to follow. Let deflection happen naturally through your turn, rather than trying consciously create it with aiming adjustments. Fire into where your instincts say the target is going, not where your eyes say it currently is. The first attempts were disasters. Pilots missed the banner by 50 feet, their bullets stitching patterns across empty sky. but Darley made them repeat the exercise again and again. 40 passes each over 3 days. No lectures about ballistics, no trigonometry, no tables of deflection angles. Just repetition with one simple instruction. Fire while you're still moving, not after you've steadied on target. By the third day, something remarkable happened. The pilots' hit rates began climbing from 6% to perhaps 12%. That doubling meant twice as many bullets hitting German aircraft, which meant twice as many kills or twice as many damaged enemy fighters returning to base, unable to fly the next mission. Darley documented his results and submitted them to Fighter Command Headquarters on August 18, 1940. His report included a crucial observation. The pilots who improved fastest were not those with the best peacetime marksmanship scores. They were those who could suppress their instinct to aim carefully and instead trust their peripheral vision and motion sense. The conscious brain, Darley argued, was too slow for modern air combat. The answer was training the subconscious to handle deflection automatically, the same way a baseball player's brain calculates where a fly ball will land without consciously solving trajectory equations. Fighter Command circulated Darley's findings, but implementation was scattered and inconsistent. Some squadrons adopted the technique enthusiastically, while others dismissed it as unscientific nonsense. The RAF's training command was particularly resistant. Their instructors had decades of experience teaching marksmanship fundamentals, and Darley's approach seemed to abandon everything they knew about proper shooting discipline. But combat results did not lie. Squadrons that embraced motion-based deflection shooting showed measurably better kill ratios through autumn 1940. The data was clear enough that by early 1941, the technique was quietly becoming standard practice, even if official training manuals had not yet caught up. American military observers in Britain took detailed notes on Darley's methods, but the United States Army Air Forces faced a different problem. Fighter pilots could potentially learn instinctive deflection through repetition, but bomber gunners could not. A Spitfire pilot controlled his entire aircraft, using motion and angles to create natural lead. A waist gunner in a B-17 stood in a fixed position, while his aircraft flew straight and level through flak, unable to maneuver, unable to use aircraft movement to generate deflection. He had only his hands on the gun and his eyes on the target. If conscious calculation was too slow and instinctive motion was unavailable, the solution had to be mechanical. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology entered the picture, specifically the Radiation Laboratories Division 7, established in early 1942. The name was deliberate misdirection. Radiation Laboratory suggested atomic research, which helped maintain secrecy around what Division 7 actually built fire control systems. The division head, Dr. Charles Stark Draper, was a 40-year-old engineer who had spent the previous decade developing gyroscopic instruments for aircraft navigation. Draper understood that the deflection problem was not fundamentally about shooting, but about prediction. A gun sight needed to show the gunner not where the target currently was, but where the target would be when the bullets arrived. The Mark 14 computing gun sight emerged from Draper's laboratory in prototype form by July 1943. It looked like something from science fiction. A reflector sight connected to a gyroscope system, weighing 28 pounds, and requiring electrical power from the aircraft's generator. The gunner operated it through a mechanical ranging control, turning a dial to match reference marks to the target's wingspan, which gave the sight the range information it needed. Then he tracked the target for approximately 2 seconds, while keeping it centered in a small tracking circle. During those 2 seconds, the gyroscope measured the target's angular velocity, how fast it was moving across the gunner's field of view. The Mark 14's internal mechanism used a series of cams and gears, analog computers built from machined metal, to solve the deflection equation in real time. It took the range input from the gunner, the angular velocity from the gyroscope, and the known ballistic properties of the .50 caliber round, then calculated exactly how far ahead of the target the guns needed to point. It displayed the result as a lighted reticle that appeared to float in space ahead of the target. The gunner no longer aimed at the aircraft, but at the glowing dot. If he had ranged correctly and tracked smoothly, the dot showed him exactly where to shoot. The Mark 14 solved mathematics that would take a human brain several minutes using pencil and paper, solving those equations 30 times per second, continuously updating as the target's angle and range changed. Testing at Naval Air Station Norfolk, Virginia during August 1943 produced results that seemed almost impossible. Gunners who had never achieved better than 5% hit rates against crossing targets immediately jumped to 18% with the Mark 10 on their first day using the system. After a week of practice, rates climbed above 25%, a five-fold improvement over manual aiming, translating directly into 5 times more enemy aircraft damaged or destroyed per engagement. But manufacturing and installing tens of thousands of Mark 14 sights across the bomber fleet would take time the Allies did not have. Production did not begin in meaningful numbers until early 1944, and installation priority went to new aircraft rolling off assembly lines, rather than retrofitting existing bombers. Most gunners flying missions through late 1943 and early 1944 were still using basic iron sights or crude reflector sights with no computing ability. They needed something they could implement immediately, without waiting for new technology, without requiring electrical modifications to their aircraft. They needed a technique that worked with the equipment they already had. The breakthrough came not from engineers or scientists, but from combat gunners themselves, specifically from the Pacific Theater, where engagement distances and visibility were often better than over cloud-covered Europe. Staff Sergeant William Fleming, a waist gunner who by March 1944 had flown 31 combat missions and survived 4 aircraft losses, was not an officer and did not have a college education. He could not explain gyroscopic precession if his life depended on it. But he had fired approximately 40,000 rounds in combat and had personally witnessed hits on 7 enemy aircraft. He had also kept a notebook. Fleming's notebook contained something unusual: sketches of enemy aircraft with hand-drawn lines extending forward from their noses, showing where he had actually aimed during successful engagements. He had measured these lead distances by comparing them to the target aircraft's length 2 plane lengths ahead, or 3 plane lengths ahead. On March 14, 1944, Fleming presented his notebook to Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch O'Hare during a routine debriefing session. O'Hare, already a Medal of Honor recipient and one of the Navy's top tacticians, immediately recognized what he was seeing: empirical deflection data gathered under actual combat conditions. O'Hare ordered Fleming to conduct training sessions with every gunner in the air group, not classroom lectures but practical exercises using a simple technique that became known as the spot shooting method. Fleming would have gunners stand at their positions while another crew member walked along the flight deck holding a model aircraft on a pole. As the model flew past at various angles, Fleming coached gunners to extend their aim forward by specific increments: 1 aircraft length for slight crossing angles, 2 lengths for moderate angles, 3 or more for steep crossing shots. The key was giving gunners a visual reference they could remember and apply instantly. Count plane lengths forward from the nose, then fire. The Lexington's gunnery officer, skeptical but desperate for anything that might work, authorized controlled testing during the carrier's operations off Truk Lagoon in late March 1944. He pulled ammunition expenditure and hit confirmation data for the previous 8 weeks, then tracked the same metrics after Fleming's training program. The results were undeniable. Prior to the training, the air group's gunners averaged 4.2 hits per 100 rounds fired against crossing targets. By the end of April, just 6 weeks after implementing spot shooting, that rate had climbed to 9.1 hits per 100. The technique had more than doubled their effectiveness. Word spread through the Pacific Fleet with remarkable speed. By May 1944, variations of Fleming's spot shooting method were being taught aboard carriers Essex, Enterprise and Bunker Hill. Each carrier's gunnery officers added their own refinements, but the core principle remained: give gunners a simple visual measurement system tied directly to the target's apparent size, eliminating the need for conscious calculation. A gunner did not need to know he was compensating for 0.3 seconds of bullet flight time. He just needed to remember 3 plane lengths forward for a crossing shot. The technique worked because it matched how human visual processing actually functions. Our brains are exceptional at relative size comparison, but terrible at absolute distance estimation. Asking a gunner to lead by 50 feet meant nothing when he had no reference for what 50 feet looked like at 300 yards. But leading by 2 plane lengths gave him an immediate visual standard he could apply without thought. The 0 he was tracking provided its own measuring stick. He just had to extend that measurement forward into empty space. The Army Air Forces adopted similar training protocols by mid-1944, though they called it radius of action shooting. Technical manuals began including illustrations showing proper lead distances, expressed in multiples of target wingspan or fuselage length. The 8th Air Force Gunnery School at Lavenham, England rebuilt their entire training program around the technique during June 1944. Mission loss rates, while still significant, began declining. July 1944 showed 3.4% bomber losses per mission compared to 5.2% the previous October. That difference represented hundreds of crew members who flew home instead of dying over Germany. But knowing the technique and executing it under combat conditions remained 2 entirely different challenges. The human brain, even armed with the spot shooting method, still fought against itself when shooting started. Psychologists embedded with the Army Air Forces documented this phenomenon extensively during 1944 interviews with returning gunners. The issue was not knowledge. Gunners could recite proper lead distances perfectly during debriefings. The issue was that conscious knowledge evaporated under stress, replaced by primal instinct that screamed, "Aim at the threat." Captain Harold Klein, an Army psychologist stationed at Bovingdon, studied this response through analysis of gun camera footage paired with post-mission interviews. He identified a pattern he termed threat fixation collapse. Gunners would start an engagement using proper deflection, but as the enemy fighter closed and perceived danger intensified, their aim point would progressively drift backward until they were shooting directly at or even behind the target. Klein's data showed this collapse happened fastest during head-on attacks where closing speed between bomber and fighter exceeded 500 miles per hour, and the gunner had perhaps 2 seconds before the enemy opened fire. Under that extreme stress, rational technique dissolved into pure reaction point. At the scary thing, pull trigger. The only solution was repetition, so extensive that deflection, shooting bypassed conscious thought entirely, embedding itself at the same neurological level as walking or catching a thrown ball. This required training time the military could not 1942 and 1943. But by late 1944, with Allied control of the air improving and training pipelines more established, gunnery schools extended their programs. The standard course that had been 4 weeks in 1942 expanded to 8 weeks, then 10. Students now fired 5,000 rounds during training instead of 1,000. Significantly, over half of those rounds went toward moving targets at realistic combat speeds. The Naval Air Gunner School at Jacksonville, Florida pioneered a particularly effective drill starting in August 1944. They mounted 50 caliber guns on motorized turrets that could spin and elevate rapidly, then had high-speed boats tow targets across the water at speeds up to 60 miles per hour, while varying their distance and crossing angles randomly. Gunner trainees engaged these targets repeatedly, 50 to 70 passes per day, until the act of leading became automatic. Instructors did not correct students verbally during drills. They simply had them shoot, check their hit pattern, adjust, and shoot again. The subconscious learned through feedback loops faster than the conscious mind learned through instruction. Elite gunners who survived 30 or more missions demonstrated something remarkable in combat footage analysis. Their deflection aim points remained stable even under intense stress. When an F-190 came screaming through the formation with cannon fire flashing from its wings, these experienced gunners maintained their lead automatically. Their conscious minds could be terrified. Many admitted to being absolutely convinced they were about to die during certain engagements. But their hands kept the proper sight picture anyway. They had achieved what martial artists call mushin, or no mind, the state where technique happens without conscious direction. But that level of proficiency took time and ammunition most gunners never received. The mathematics of wartime training were brutal. If creating an expert deflection shooter required 5,000 practice rounds and 10 weeks of intensive training, but the bomber offensive needed 50,000 new gunners in 6 months, compromises were inevitable. The majority of gunners flying combat missions never achieved true unconscious competence. They remained perpetually in the conscious competent stage, capable of proper deflection, shooting when conditions allowed them time to think, but vulnerable to collapse under extreme stress or when facing unexpected tactical situations. This created a strange stratification in combat effectiveness. A bomber formation's defensive firepower was not uniform. It depended heavily on which specific gunners were in which specific positions on which specific aircraft. A formation that happened to include several veterans with deep training could fight off attacks that would devastate a formation of newer crews. German fighter pilots learned to identify and exploit this, targeting bombers that showed hesitant or inaccurate fire during initial passes, avoiding formations where defensive fire was immediate, heavy, and precisely placed. The deflection shooting revolution that began with British experiments and American desperation did not end when World War II concluded in 1945. The core principle, that you must aim where the target will be, not where it is, became foundational to every weapon system developed afterward. The Mark 14 computing gun sight evolved into the Mark 18, which served through the Korean War, then into digital fire control computers that could process dozens of variables simultaneously. By Vietnam, fighter aircraft carried radar-assisted gun systems that calculated deflection automatically, requiring pilots only to keep targets within acquisition parameters. The F-4 Phantom's lead computing optical sight system accomplished in my Takens what had taken Draper's mechanical gyroscopes significant fractions of a second. Modern air-to-air combat has largely moved beyond guns entirely. Missiles handle interception at ranges where deflection would require leading by miles rather than feet. But the underlying physics has not changed, just the implementation. An AIM-120 AMRAAM missile uses inertial guidance and active radar to continuously update its trajectory toward where its target will be, executing deflection calculations thousands of times per second. The F-22 The Raptor's APG-77 radar does not just track targets. It predicts their future positions, based on current velocity and acceleration, then positions the aircraft and selects weapons accordingly. It is the same problem William Fleming solved with hand-drawn sketches in 1944, now handled by computers processing teraflops instead of gunners counting plane lengths. Interestingly, deflection shooting fundamentals remain part of modern fighter pilot training. Despite guns being tertiary weapons in contemporary air combat, the Navy Fighter Weapons School, Top Gun, still teaches basic fighter maneuvers that include guns, only engagements. Not because pilots expect a dogfight with cannons, but because learning to visually predict where a maneuvering target will be develops spatial awareness that applies to every aspect of air combat. A pilot who has mastered deflection shooting intuitively understands closure rates, angle, off, and lead pursuit curves, concepts that matter whether firing a cannon or positioning for a missile shot. The lessons extend beyond aviation into any domain involving fast, moving targets. Modern anti-aircraft systems, from the Phalanx CI-2S defending naval vessels to the C-RAM protecting ground bases, are essentially sophisticated implementations of what the 1943 bomber gunners struggled to do manually. The Phalanx fires 500 rounds per minute, 75 rounds per second, at incoming missiles and aircraft, its radar continuously calculating deflection and updating aim point. It makes the same corrections Eddie Kowalski needed over the Solomon Islands, just faster and without the human hesitation that cost so many lives. Even video games that simulate combat incorporate deflection mechanics, teaching players the same counterintuitive principle: aim where the target is going. Games like War Thunder and Digital Combat Simulator require players to lead moving targets manually, and new players experience the exact same frustration 1942 gunners felt, watching their tracers pass harmlessly behind enemy aircraft until they internalize that leading is necessary. The most skilled players develop the same unconscious competence that combat veterans achieved, their hands adjusting aim without conscious thought. The transformation from 4% hit rates in early 1943 to 20+ percent by late 1944 represents one of the most dramatic tactical movements of World War II, achieved not through superior equipment or overwhelming numbers, but through understanding and working with human cognition rather than against it. Thousands of aircrewmen who would have died continued flying. Enemy fighters that would have escaped went down in flames. Bombing campaigns that might have failed reached their targets. All because someone finally acknowledged that human instinct, however strong, could be wrong, and that survival meant training people to ignore what felt natural and trust what physics demanded. The gunners who learned to aim at empty sky, who forced themselves to fire at nothing visible and trust their bullets would meet metal, proved something essential about human adaptability under pressure. We are not prisoners of our instincts. With proper understanding, sufficient training, and enough necessity, we can rewire our responses to match reality rather than demanding reality match our intuitions. That lesson, born in blood over Europe and the Pacific, remains relevant anywhere humans confront situations where instinct and solution point in opposite directions.